We had last week was really hot and humid. This week's been beautiful, so
Nice.
bouncing back and forth.
Yeah, good.
Doing our endless spring, which is nice.
And okay, nice.
Endless spring. Nobody has
Yeah.
ever referred to the Carolinas as the endless spring.
No, it's North Carolina, Scott.
I know
North
either of the
Carolina.
Carolinas.
No, we have endless spring.
No, you don't.
You come visit.
I've spent springs in both Carolinas, Tennessee, and Virginia. And what it does is, like, if you average it out, it's endless spring.
And in Ohio, why did you leave out Ohio?
Because Ohio, nobody would ever assume that it has an endless spring. That is
Endless
just
winter.
Endless dreams. Endless greatness.
Endless dreams. Oh man!
Wow,
to a good start.
Yeah, there's a lot of people still checking in. I guess maybe give them another minute or two to file
usually
in.
5. So I usually hit start. Yeah, about 5 after. For everyone who is on, thanks for coming so far. Please check to make sure that you are muted. That is very helpful.
Or not.
What's that?
I said or not. These
don't listen to
these Zoom things are always difficult for me because I never know if I'm like telling good jokes. You can't see anyone laugh.
You can be relatively assured that they are not good jokes.
No one's walking on stage to smack me. I never know where I stand.
So one thing that we do ask those that are on is to please, if you're able to, have your video on, because to Patrick's point, it's hard to present to a computer screen. It's a lot easier to present when you see facial reaction. So if you're sitting still in a manner that you could have it on, please do turn on your screen. It helps a lot for presenters. If you can't, don't worry about it, but we do appreciate those who will. I think I'm going to give it, we'll give a few more minutes. If you have questions as we go throughout, go ahead and just type them into the chat. Feel free to do so. Feel free to comment. I will be monitoring the chat as we go along, but the question and answer will come at the end. This is not a casual chat. This is a presentation, so slightly different format for those of you who come to the casual chats.
Oh, did you say you were going to have questions as we go?
No.
No. Okay.
Correct. So what will happen is if a question arises, type it in the chat. Don't try and remember it. Please do type it in the chat, but we will answer all questions at the end.
Okay, got it. Usually when you do these, they're like more kind of questions in line. Is that how you usually do it?
So our casual chat is more of a conversation. We do start off more with less of the questions asked, but just the main difference between these.
Got it.
I'll give it another minute or so. We're still have people. This is usually why I wait, is because a lot of people forget to mute when they come in, and then sort of get sorted out. But yeah, see, I told you, somewhere between 30 and 70. We're at 57. So thanks to everyone who's come. If you just logged in, please do remember to mute yourself. If you are able to, please turn on your camera though. Having video is helpful for those who are presenting. Helps us to see your face, the reactions, which guides a lot of things. Just as a presenter, you're really feeding off of the facial expressions, and then Patrick needs them just to know that somebody laughed at his jokes. On that note, I will start introducing the speakers. So this is a talk that was done at AMSC, the inaugural one of 2021, titled Building a Better Athlete. Obviously, this talk was well attended. It's something Patrick and I co-wrote a paper on this topic a few years back. And if you ignore some of the acute chronic workload stuff, it's still a really good paper. And just an ongoing issue that's frequently seen is this lack of energy system development focused and interest. Well, probably there's definitely an interest in it, but lack of, I think, understanding. It's not something that's usually discussed or covered that much. From, we all think of strength and conditioning, and the conditioning just gets tagged on, and then a lot of times it's just high intensity interval is kind of the idea of what this is. So we decided to give this talk, well received at the time, decided to go ahead and do it in a manner where we can record this as part of a upcoming thing that the Sports Performance SIG is putting together for anyone interested in high performance, which will be a sort of a guided course on these topics. So that's what this is about. I'm going to lead off, and then we will have Patrick Ward, who is director of research or something like that with the Seahawks. He will be giving us more detail and in-depth look at the energy systems and the demands of different sports. And then Michael Tankovich, who was with the Seahawks and is currently with these special operations, will be giving us a look at the practical implementation and dosage of these within that. So last time, please do make sure that you stay muted. Please do turn on your cameras if possible. And with that, we'll get going. So I do want to say thanks to Tank and Patrick for doing this. My job is to give a little bit of a background, a little bit of an understanding, but most of the heavy lifting is going to be done by those two. So I guess where we really need to start is with the understanding of the fact that sports are risky. Right? If you want to be certain to avoid a sports injury, then don't play that sport. High performance occurs at a level that's beyond health. High performance typically also occurs at a level that is beyond what training would entail. Right? The goals are different. Performance is not training. Performance is not health. So understand that we do everything we can to avoid injuries, but we have to recognize that they are part of the process. What does that mean for us? Well, in this case, a large part of our goals with energy system development are going to look more along the lines of restoration of capacity in order to ensure that the athlete, when they return, is able to perform on a platform of energy systems that are capable of supporting their performance. While there may or may not be aspects that are related to the injury prevention here, that may not be the main goal. And you will see different things like, for instance, the argument about ACL injury not being something that's fatigue. That's great. Doesn't mean we don't need to address these things. It just means that our goals for this training are different. So this paper is one where Franco is discussing some of these ideas of the fact that sometimes we have to train other factors. It's not just trying to reduce injury or prevent injury. We're also looking to allow our athletes to actually perform. So broadly, what is sports medicine? Well, we tend to do a really good job of paying attention to the tissues that are primarily impacted by the injury. But when we move away from that location, it tends to be more based on some more tenuous, like causal theory about the kinetic chain of, okay, well, we're going to work on great toe extension in order to introduce right cervical rotation. We get some things that move further and further away. But what we want to do is pull things back a little bit and make the case for training the systems that we know are required. So instead of looking at how one isolated area impacts another isolated area, we're looking at this more from a system perspective. We did just publish a series of papers in IGSPT on a systems approach to ACLR, which rehabilitation, open access, and goes into a little bit more depth on some of that idea. We know, though, that energy system development is subject to the same principles of specific adaptation to opposed demand. So the SAID principle is the one that everybody knows, but is probably the least frequently actually implemented when it comes to exercise prescription. So after the injury, it's important to consider both the tissue as well as the impact that the changes in activity will have on all the other systems. So the tissue itself needs to be addressed. However, there are a lot of changes in the interaction of the organism with their environment, which have some knock-on effects of what's going to occur here. So if we break them down, we can think of this as sports medicine treating directly related issues like the injury and secondary issues like energy system development in many cases, which may be something that is getting derailed because of the fact that the athlete can no longer do the things they used to do. Oops. So like I said, it's kind of, we can think of detraining as that knock-on effect from the disuse. It's not the primary issue, but it is something that we face with our individuals. And it's relevant to discuss any time that we have decrease in relative intensity. So another thing to bear in mind is this is all relative to where they were, where they are now. Some people will train relatively hard, but that is a low level of training compared to where they need to get back to. So it's very important to have some of these foundational understandings of the demands of the sport. Patrick's going to go into some more specific detail on some of those. And then the other thing to bear in mind is from an energy system perspective, time frames are really going to help inform a lot of this for you. The longer that you spend in this case of that disuse, the more we're going to start seeing various aspects that will detrain. So in some cases, if we're talking a week or two, not that big of a deal. If we're talking months, now things start becoming a bigger issue. So definition-wise, detraining is going to be defined as the partial or complete loss of training-induced anatomical, physiological, and performance adaptations, which I think is a pretty decent definition there. Something we can kind of look at is what is happening, what is detraining, then our goal is to ensure that we do it. We do have a hot mic out there. If somebody can, everybody check your mics. Please make sure that you are muted. Thank you. So this paper by Majinka and Padilla, and I'm sure I'm butchering both of their names, really good paper, really good discussion of this. And he's led a lot of the research on kind of these topics of detraining. So what does happen when we detrain? Well, we have to start off by understanding what happens when we train. Mostly good things occur. Exercise-induced cardiac remodeling. So different models will look at the training from different perspectives. Here, I'm looking at it from a central adaptation, so cardiac aspect, and then some of the blood flow and peripheral adaptation aspects. So we'll get some biventricular eccentric hypertrophy, so increase in some of the ability, basically the ability of the ventricle to produce blood output, which helps us increase our stroke volume at a relative or lower heart rate. We're going to get some increased diastolic function. We're going to get some dilation of the atrium, right? We're going to get some blood volume expansion with the blood itself. We're going to get some significant increases in blood plasma. This happens relatively quickly. At a slower pace, we're going to start seeing some of the blood cell, red blood cells start going up. This one paper looked at this and found that about 4% over 15 weeks of training in young to middle-age exercisers. I believe that's the second reference down on that slide. So what else? Well, training effects-wise, we have VO2 max, right? Despite its potential limitations as a valuable metric, it's a good proxy for changes that do occur. We see significant increases. We know that's modifiable. Mitochondria plays a significant role, and we do see both changes in density and capacity in response to steady state, high intensity interval training, and sprint interval training. So we can get after some of those adaptations with all of them. Peripheral capillarization leads to an increased ability of energy demands to be met locally. So with the body being able to handle more volume of exercise, we get better buffering capacity and et cetera. We're going to also have some increase in the velocity at ventilatory threshold. This is key because it allows us to perform the same level of output with less energy or perform a higher level of output without shifting into a fatiguing byproduct. So it lets us, this is why some of these guys who can run a mile in just incredible, sub 4 minute miles, they're putting out a lot more effort, but physiologically they are buffering at a similar rate as anybody else. It's just that they can go a lot faster at that same level. So performing better without shifting into some of the fatiguing byproducts. So we also get faster recovery with this population. So the non-endurance athlete, the field and court sports, especially those brief intervals of high intensity exercise followed by longer duration of lower intensity, that ability to recover in between is massive. These are all things that we tend to see here, and they're all great things. They're things we care about. It's why we train. And the area of detraining, though, is more of a newer concept with more of the current discussion. Like, it's interesting, you look at the literature, there's a lot of stuff on astronauts, for instance. That's been a big area because of the deficits that occur from your time in space. There's had to be a lot more interest in that. Injuries, over the last couple years, we've seen a lot of discussion on it around COVID because of everything being shut down. So a lot of detraining occurred, and then athletes had to ramp back up relatively quickly. So there's more and more data coming out on it, but it's not quite as well studied as some of the areas of training. So what happens with detraining? Well, relatively speaking, bad things. Remember, relative, it's bad because we want to be performing at a high level. From your organism's perspective, it's good because it's being efficient. So this was an interesting study looking at a group of runners who were training up for a marathon. Then they ran the race and then dropped afterwards they weren't allowed to train more than 2 hours a week. Each training session had to be less than an hour. So it's kind of hard to get people to volunteer to train that hard and then not do anything. So they kept it as low as they could and still quantify it as detraining relative to previously. This image shows you a good sort of view of that progression, going up, going up, going up. They run the race. And then they took measurements at 2 time points, 4 weeks post detraining, and then 8 weeks post detraining. So their question was, what happens when we detrain? And I thought this was a pretty well done image that they provided here. What they tended to find is that by 4 weeks, there was a significant reduction in the left ventricular wall thickness. And then by 8 weeks, there was also a significant reduction in the right ventricular size. So first of all, we get some atrophy of the muscle itself, and then we get atrophy of the size of the ventricle. No real changes seen in the left ventricle size in this study. It has been seen in other studies that did actual full detraining. So maybe it's an element of the left ventricle is easier to maintain size with just some sort of a stress. So that's something that's being looked into. From a blood perspective, by about 4 weeks, they found a really rapid drop there with the blood and plasma volume. Dropped rapidly and maintained down for that 8 week period. So sure, that's interesting, but we're talking about non-endurance athletes. What about those who are not endurance athletes? Well, it has been looked at in some non-endurance sports. There's a study looking at aerobic fitness for soccer players. So my slideshow just froze on me. That's always nice. There we go. So rehab did make some changes, but ultimately it was insufficient, or they concluded that running speed at VO2 max at ventilatory threshold 1 and at ventilatory threshold 2 were significantly lower in the ACL group than in the control group. And while it did increase during the rehab process after the surgery, 6 months of standard rehabilitation was not sufficient to restore aerobic function after the reconstruction. Their conclusion is that more attention should probably be paid to the aerobic system in these settings. So while some change did occur, it was insufficient. And by 6 months post, which we would tend to anticipate adaptations at that time frame being well trained, right? You can get back to some aerobic stuff relatively soon. So the fact that it was not happening in standard process made these authors feel that it was worth recommending that we do a little bit more. So What things are happening with detraining? Well, basically a reversal of a lot of the other stuff. We see a drop in VO2 max, up to 20% drop in those who are highly trained. We tend to see a drop in end diastolic volume. We see a drop in stroke volume, cardiac output, ejection fraction, concentration of hemoglobin, and hematocrit. We see an increase in resting heart rate. Peripherally, we start seeing a decrease in muscle oxidative capacity after a few days week. Remember the mitochondria we were talking about earlier. They will both reduce inefficiency per organelle as well as total concentration in the region. And that starts happening within 1 week, right? And then capillary density, 4 to 8 weeks of detraining, we'll start seeing some drops there. So not great, but unfortunately, pretty much every training adaptation is reversible. Somebody comes in and says to you at their clinic, or they come in to train and they tell you all the things they used to do 10 to 15 years ago. Well, that was nice for you then, but you don't get to bring any of it forward. I'm sure they brushed their teeth 10 years ago. Doesn't mean that they're not still doing it now, right? So fitness is unfortunately a perishable quality. The fact that you can train it up also means that you can train it down. And a good model to visualize this training up and training down is the idea of the envelope of function. Scott Dye is the one who proposed this. What I want you to think about is if we draw a y-axis that has load on it, or you can think of this as intensity, and then frequency or volume would be along the x-axis. All the way to the bottom left, at some point we hit a zone of physiological underloading. So the load and or frequency is too low to stimulate, and so the body starts de-adapting. And then if we go up the y-axis and to the right on the x-axis, at some point we cross over the line into where we start having problems. So we're overtraining the area. All of these can be visualized within that. So a good way to look at this is a minimum effective dosage versus a maximum tolerated dosage. Minimum effective is the least amount of stimulation to inspire the training adaptations that you care about. Maximum tolerated dosage is going to be the most that you can impose on this individual without causing some problems. Now, this is going to vary depending on what we're talking about. It's also going to vary depending on the training that's going on outside of it. So it's not a locked in, once you figure this out, it's forever this. This is a fluid model that you're utilizing every time you think of things to ensure that you actually have an understanding of where you're at and what dosage you're looking for. So we can think of this as sort of that zone of super physiological overload, as Scott Dye said, or we're more familiar with the idea of overtraining, right? And then that envelope of function, maybe we could put it in between there, or probably better to call that the envelope of training, right? That's where training for capacity occurs. And that is all related to that specific adaptation to impose demand. However, one thing we need to really bear in mind, especially when we're dealing with an injury, is this whole concept of what is the limiting factor. Somebody comes in, they tell you they're a runner and they run in order to get in better shape. Well, what if they're dealing with patellofemoral pain? Cardiovascular system is no longer the lymphatic when it comes to running with patellofemoral pain. The pain is the limiting factor. You do not run to the point of cardiovascular training. You run to the point of basically tolerance. So your running is no longer an aerobic session. It is now a tolerance session or graded exposure potentially for that knee. So whatever the limiting factor is what determines what you're doing. The modality does not determine what's done. Your ability to stress the system, and whichever system is reaching that minimum effective dosage first, is the system that is actually going to be trained, right? So somebody who goes on a bike ride for the first time, well, their quads are going to be incredibly sore, probably before they're building up a bunch of fatigue there locally. They're not going to get as good of an aerobic response as they will later on once they get trained up. Or the upper body ergometer, same idea. So when you first introduce a modality, it may take you some time to develop the ability to then target central adaptations that you're looking for. So just bear in mind that you always have to establish what the limiting factor is with what you're doing. Just because you're doing the same exercise doesn't imply that you're getting the same training effect. Systems adapt, and they do it based off of the area that's getting that dosage, that stimulation. So local does not equal system training, right? So what now? Well, we need to understand what the energy systems are and how to test and train them. This allows us to identify where we are and compare that to where we need to be so that we're able to audit our own process as we move forward. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Patrick Ward.
All right, thanks. Let me share this screen. Which one do I want, actually? I don't even know.
This will be fun.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. I think it's this one. Let's see what happens. Did it come up? What do you see?
You need to switch, click swap displays, and we'll be good.
Okay. Let me slide this over here.
Where
Now you can see.
Yeah.
Assuming if I
So
do
share.
this, what do you see now?
Go up to the top where
I
instead
see
of
what
hitting
happened.
instead of hitting end show, just hit swap displays, and that should do it.
Oh, well, I already ended the show. So let's see about this one. No. All right. What do you see now?
Hit swap displays.
Where do you see that? Oh, I see.
Right at the top.
I got it. All right. How's that?
We're good now.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Scott. That was a good talk. That was the first time I've ever heard it. I think when we did this talk, I was like busy because it was the middle of the season. So Scott made me record my lecture, and then he talked, and then he played an audio recording of me, and then Tank talked. So that was the first time I ever heard it. It's the first time I've really ever listened to Scott. It was pretty good though. So anyway, hopefully I can remember what I said during the original talk. But so Scott did a nice job kind of laying out information about training and detraining, why these things are important, sort of the competing factors that we have to deal with, and some of the current gaps that we might face within the clinical environment with respect to athletes lacking a true fitness component. And this is really important. And because, not only does it prevent detraining, but it really streamlines the road back to the field or to the court. And so a key objective for us here today is to lay out a framework. And Scott gave us a nice physiology background on training and detraining. I'm going to lay out that framework, and then I'm going to hand it off to Michael, and he's going to walk through some case examples of how this framework actually works in real life. I think a few of them are things that we worked together on before he left me. So let's move on here. Okay, so a basic energy system overview. I'm not going to beat this to death because I'm going to operate under the assumption that everybody has taken some, exercise physiology 101 somewhere within their educational curriculum. So we're just going to go super high level, really quick. The goal of the energy systems is to meet the demands. Scott mentioned this. Energy systems are working all the time, no matter what it is we're doing, sitting here listening to this lecture, lifting weights, going for a run, riding a bike, etc. The goal is to mobilize energy. And the one thing that we just want to get out of the way and appreciate is the little chart that I made down there on the bottom right. The considerable overlap between the three primary energy systems. So we've got phosphagen, glycolytic system, and the oxidative system. And I've broken the glycolytic into anaerobic and aerobic systems. But you can see the considerable overlap. And I just want you to appreciate that when we sometimes read these things within our exercise physiology textbooks, they tend to look as if these energy systems turn on and off like light switches. So after 6 seconds, phosphagen system turns off, glycolysis turns on. After 3 minutes, oxidative turns on, glycolysis turns off. That is not true. These systems are always working. They're just working in different contributions depending on a number of factors. So things like context, intensity, and duration of activity matter. Those are going to dictate the percentage or the relative percentage of each of these energy systems. Current fitness level, if you're unfit, that's going to dictate the percentage of contribution from these energy systems. And that's one of the things that we'd like to hopefully mitigate the detraining effect, because we want the right energy systems working at the right times. Residual fatigue affects us. You might be really fit, but you might be totally exhausted from a tough competition the day before or a hard training session. That's going to influence the way in which you perform. And then task, and Scott hinted at this a little bit. I'm going to talk a lot more about this when we talk about testing athletes, is this idea of familiarity and novelty. If I've never done a UBE, I'm probably not giving you a reliable picture of my current level of fitness until I become a little bit more familiar. And we're going to talk specifically about team sport athletes today. I know, endurance athletes are sort of a different animal. When people think about team sport athletes, they often think about, as Scott described, performing these very brief bouts of high intensity activity and then having these much longer bouts of recovery. And that goes kind of on and off throughout the competition. And this is true. But I'd like to point everybody to a great paper by Stone and Kilding that I've referenced up in the top right. And this is a review on aerobic conditioning in team sport athletes and how important it is. The more fit that you can become, the more high output you can maintain when you have to do those brief efforts. The faster you recover between those brief efforts, the faster you recover between competitions. And so that's really important to consider. Here's just another slide. We're going to pass over this quickly. It's basically showing the same thing. This slide is one of the worst slides I've ever made because it shows exactly what I said not to do, which is think of these things as light switches, basically one turning on and turning off. I just am showing it right now, and then I'll never show it again, I promise, so that we can appreciate the inverse relationship between intensity and duration, and which we all intuitively are aware of. As intensity goes down, duration goes up. I can't obviously maintain my maximal effort at, for greater than 3 minutes. Even those athletes who are running the mile in 4 minutes and something seconds, or, very impressive. That's a very high effort, but they could probably even go faster. They just won't even be able to make it a mile. So it's all going to be relative to the person. We'll move on from that, and we'll get into how can we relate this to sport? How do we relate this to what we do or what you guys do? I'm the non-clinician here, so I'll steer away from that stuff. How do we relate this to what you guys do as clinicians? So the first question to always ask is, what the heck does the athlete have to be ready for? And needs analysis is the most important place to start. It's where I always start. And it's there to help us identify the physical requirements of the sport. Even if you've worked with this sport for the past 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you feel like you've got it, write this stuff down, write down the needs analysis, because it'll help you in your mind organize the way in which training and adaptations might unfold as the athlete's going through the return to play process. And as you're either writing the training program or as you're helping hand the training off to, let's say, the strength and conditioning staff who you might be working with if you're in a team environment, or maybe a strength coach or personal trainer if you're in a clinical environment that that satisfies those two types of things within underneath one roof. I've put some links or some references down there to 2 strength and conditioning articles from NSCA Strength and Conditioning Journal. I thought they did a great job of laying out needs analysis. Where do we start? I always start whenever I start thinking about or working with another sport with a literature search. You can go to Google or Google Scholar or PubMed or whatever favorite search engine you have, type in time motion analysis and then the sport, and you'll usually get back some sort of research that is directed at that sport and the physical requirements, the biomechanical requirements, and that'll help you at least have some sort of compass. The one thing I would say is be specific to the population. So, level of competition matters, gender matters, et cetera. It doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to take, time motion analysis from English Premier League soccer players and go and apply it to the, school age children at the local middle school. Very different athletes, very different levels of development. So make sure that you're always cognizant of this stuff. And of course, you might run into situations where your sport lacks research. And this was the situation I was in 10 years ago, starting in the NFL. There was lots of epidemiological research. There was lots of kind of nice research around injuries and some research around the way in which college football players physically develop strength and power and size, body mass, and things like that across their college tenure. But there really wasn't anything dictating the physiological requirements of the game, aside from what we could just naturally see on Sunday when we turn on the TV and we know, okay, players run and they run hard and they hit each other. But that wasn't really distinct. So what do you do if you're in this situation? Maybe you're an athletic trainer, you work at a middle school. What do you do if there's no time motion analysis on, 8th grade women's lacrosse? You got to conduct your own analysis. And this is really fun. It can be tedious, but it's super interesting. You'll learn a lot about your sport. And this is what I actually did. I started out until a year in. Then we started getting player tracking data from the NFL that was capturing in-game demands. So then I could be a little bit more objective with the quantification, or be a little more direct rather with the quantification. But this is what it looked like. I actually set up a kind of a manually coded system. You can see some of the definitions across the top of the horizontal axis in the table down there. I had a document that corresponded to each of the things that were going across the top. I had about 10 features and I had operational definitions, and I tried to be really clear about what a change of direction was and what it would look like and what a defensive block was, or a fall with contact, and how those were different. And I needed to be clear so that I knew what it meant for me, but also so that I knew what it meant if I were to say, hand this over to Michael and said, hey, can you manually code a game for me, or manually code the first quarter of a game. So I built this system, put this together, and then I needed to know, how good is it? So I can't just hope for the best, start charting things. So I began by quantifying things like intra-rater and inter-rater reliability. So intra-rater is basically me to myself. If I can't agree with myself, and I can't watch the same thing and agree with myself, I'm going to have a really hard time agreeing with Scott. So that would be inter-rater reliability. So I started with the inter-rater reliability. I actually did a bunch of games, a bunch of players, different position groups, coded out the stuff, and then I set aside the system and I set aside those games for 5 or 6 weeks, and then I came back to them and I did them again without looking at what I had done 5 or 6 weeks prior. And when I was done with that, I had a way then of analyzing my manually coded games and saying, geez, how well did I agree with myself? So the ICC, the intra-class correlation coefficient for a single rater, was pretty high. So this is for like the continuous variables, things like distance, things like time of play, which I would watch the copies of the game and I would actually do it with a stopwatch and write down times from ball snap to play end, or from ball snap to whistle. Things like that, I was actually pretty good, 0.91. My kappa coefficient, which was there for me to basically quantify how reliable I was at looking at some of these count measures, I had fair agreement. So I was generally okay, but not overwhelmingly good or overwhelmingly reliable with myself. But that allowed me to then look at which of those fields, is it change of direction? Is it static exertion? Is it a defensive block? Which of those fields did I have the greatest error? And then how do I tighten up my operational definition and be a little bit more specific with? So that was what I did to start out. And then I started getting, player tracking data and building more refined analysis. So if you don't have a system, or if there is no literature, just do your own a video camera, an Excel sheet, and a little bit of elbow grease, and you can learn a ton about the sport and the athletes that play it. So the reason for conducting analyses of sport is that we want to be able to build a scientific approach to training that helps us underpin those demands and know exactly what we're building the athlete back to. It helps us refine our testing process and know what we're testing and why we're testing it. It helps us build more comprehensive training programs that we can either write ourselves or articulate those demands to the strength coaches who might be writing the programs for us. And then it helps us monitor any of the key performance indicators so that we can understand whether or not the person is getting better, whether or not they're improving, or maybe even whether or not they're falling within that zone between the minimum effective dose and the maximum tolerated dose that Scott showed us on his slide. So one of the ways you can show this is a fitness polygon. It came from Super Training, Verkhoshansky and Sif's textbook. The dashed line is the average athlete for this given sport in 8 biomotor qualities. The black line is this individual athlete. We can see that this athlete tends to fare pretty well and be a better than average in the endurance type of biomotor qualities, and maybe a little less on the strength and speed stuff. So that might be an area where training takes place, where training is a focus. I don't always love these kinds of charts. If I put on my data science hat, generally radar plots are a no-no, but it came from Verkhoshansky, and you can't do an energy system talk without referencing something from Russian literature. So there it is. Generally, this is the way that I like to do my needs analyses, because it's very clear. I can hand this over to Michael. I can hand it over to a strength coach. They can read it and get a very defined sense of what it is I'm trying to describe with respect to the competition, with respect to the sport or the game. So the way I do this is I set it up going left to right. I have the sport. You can even add in any information around the context, whether it's gender or age group or things like that. I have the work to rest ratio that might have come from the literature. I've put some different examples down there at the bottom. It might have come from manually creating your own system like I did. You have a work to rest ratio that tells us a little bit about the bioenergetic demands that might be necessary. We have information about the total locomotor distance. So locomotor being anything that's on legs, like running, jogging, walking, etc. Just how much distance is being covered. That's like a volume metric. We have information about the intensity of the activities within the sport. So things like sprint efforts, numbers of change of directions or lateral movements, number of jumps or accelerations or decelerations. And then we have some of the more typical movement demands that we might need to be aware of if we're building a training process or building a training program. And so you can get very specific with this stuff. We can see the basketball example, generally 6 seconds of work, 22 seconds of rest. In the soccer example, they actually define this at the Premier League level as purposeful movements, where purposeful movement is things like possessing the ball or challenging an opponent who is possessing the ball, or running, sprinting to get in position for a pass, or sprinting back on defense. Non-purposeful movements, which happen, purposeful movements happen about a 2-to-1 ratio in soccer. Non-purposeful movements being standing, walking, jogging, nothing that's really specific to the game. Obviously, soccer players cover more distance than the basketball players, and we can work all the way left to right and see very specifically what on average we need to be able to prepare the athlete to return to. American football can be its own animal. We could literally have a needs analysis for every single position group, because most of the position groups have very divergent ergonomic demands. And so they're going to require different amounts of locomotor distance. They might require different amounts of work to rest ratio. If you're a outside cornerback, you probably never come off the field. You're always on, working on and off as the defensive series takes place until you can get off the field. If you're a wide receiver, you might get subbed out every 2 or 3 plays as the team moves into different packages of personnel. So, football, we could have its own needs analysis. It could be very specific. And again, even if you've worked in the sport for 10 or 20 years, write this stuff down. If you change coaching staffs, you change schematics, which means you change the needs analysis, you change the demands on the athlete. Once we understand what the demands are, we move into testing. And testing is going to help us explore where the athlete is currently and then where we need to get them to. So how do we go about this? First, Scott mentioned this. He did a great job of talking about some of the constraints in the clinical setting. These are always going to be something that you need to initially be aware of. Things like upper extremity only. It might be lower extremity off legs. It might be lower extremity straight line only. It might be lower extremity with change of direction, meaning you're probably getting close to the end stages of rehab and you can do all of the things. There's a variety of testing modalities that are open to us: upper body ergometers, bikes, rowers. You can obviously do running in the pool, running in the Alter G. All of these things are going to be modified by the constraints. And then there's a bunch of tests that we can use. So there's lots of different intermittent tests for field sport athletes, like yo-yo intermittent recovery test, beep test, 30-15 intermittent fitness test. There's basic ramp protocols that you can use, or there's time trials or distance trials. And I've put those in red. And the reason why I've highlighted those specifically is because they're super easy to apply across multiple testing modalities. They also offer us an easy way to determine an athlete's max aerobic speed. So what is maximal aerobic speed? Maximal aerobic speed represents the lowest velocity where an individual's VO2 max occurs. And in Scott's opening talk, he explained this as velocity at VO2 max. This is what it's often referred to. They're sometimes used a bit interchangeably. This is a way to test athletes, build a max aerobic speed kind of calculator, and then plan training intensity from there. Great paper by Dan Baker when he was with the Brisbane Broncos in the National Rugby League of Australia. It references down there. It's an awesome paper on how to set this up for team sport, field sport athletes. So what does it look like? How do we administer this test? We're going to perform a 4 to 6 minute time trial in whatever modality. Again, the constraints will dictate this in whatever modality the athlete will be training on. A bike, if it's an athlete that's unable to run for a longer period of time, for example. And the max aerobic speed is calculated as the distance covered within the specified time interval. So let's take an example. Top right, we have a 5-minute test. We're going to, which is 300 seconds. The athlete completed just over half a mile, 0.67 miles. So a little bit of simple calculation tells us that that athlete is working during that 5 minutes at about 8.04 miles per hour. We are going to set that at 100% of their max aerobic speed or velocity at VO2 max. And then from there, I've created just 5 percentage point buckets below, calculating up and down. So we have a way of assigning intensities to the training. And you could use 10% or whatever percentage really kind of makes sense to you. So super easy to administer, just some key considerations. One, we have to allow a few sessions for familiarization. Scott mentioned this earlier, and I mentioned it briefly on my first slide about energy systems. Familiarity matters. If I've never done a UBE, the first time I do it is not a great time to do a max aerobic test because I have no idea what I'm doing. I will not be giving you a reliable picture of my current physiology. So my suggested approach would be that within that athlete's return to play program, you have a component where for 3 or 4 sessions over 2 weeks or a week, they're going to do 5 to 10 or 15 minutes of UBE work and get used to what it feels like to do upper body cyclical activity before you then begin to test them on the max aerobic speed. And it might be continuous work for a period of time. It might be some interval work. You just need to get them familiar with doing this activity. The other consideration is try and monitor heart rate response when you do this. You want to look for divergent responses that may indicate a poor exercise choice. Scott talked about this a little bit before. If I am a great runner, but I don't really cycle, I might get on the bike and totally burn out on a test because my thighs are burning. I fail peripherally, but not cardiovascularly. And maybe I have to have more familiarization with the activity, or maybe I have to find a different activity, something else. So those are the considerations I would go with. Once we've tested the athlete, we know where they're at, we understand the demands of the sport, we're ready to build our training program. And when we sit down and do this, there's really, in my head, 3 training parameters that we have to be aware of: the work interval, the recovery interval, and the series. And I'll explain that in a second. The work interval has 3 variables to manipulate: intensity, duration, and modality. The recovery interval, duration and active or passive. You could have a recovery interval where the athlete gives you a hard effort and then does nothing. You could have a recovery interval where the athlete first works at a certain pace and then does something active. That might be like if you're trying to stimulate more game type demands. And then the series, which is the cluster of work intervals, we can manipulate the number of series, the duration of series, the time between series, and again, whether we have active or passive rest between those series. So how does a series work? Let's say Michael is preparing an athlete for a strength and conditioning program, and he assigns that athlete to do 5 minutes of 30 seconds on and 30 seconds off, or 30 seconds easy on the bike. So that's 5 sets, 5 minutes, 5 sets of a 30-second work interval and a 30-second rest interval. That's one series. So then he says, then after that, I want you to take 2 minutes break, get some water, and then I want you to repeat that series and then do 2 minutes break and repeat that series again. So we have 3 series of 5 minutes of 30 on, 30 off with a 2-minute passive rest in between. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, leave it in the chat and I can try and explain it, or maybe Michael will do a better job of unpacking it during his piece. Once we know the parameters to consider, we can begin to build a menu of training methods. This is something that I feel like I've visited so many teams and clubs and sports organizations across the world, and people do not do a good job of this. If it was me and I was a rehab professional with a sports team, or I'm a rehab professional in a clinical setting where I have strength coaches and personal trainers that I'm working side by side, every year I want to sit down and write out the training methods menu. This is stuff that Tank and I have worked on before when we worked together. This makes it very explicit for everybody to understand exactly what the training program is, exactly what the training methods are designed to do, which adaptations we're trying to target, how the training program will look, and ways in which we can then progress the training program further as the athlete improves. So it's really easy to do. I've broken this one up into short duration, repeated effort type of modalities, and then long duration endurance type of modalities. So working left to right, we see the type of interval that we're going to perform, and then we see each of the different training parameters we just covered over the top. So let's take an example: explosive effort. This is going to be really challenging, over 120% MAS. So they're going to be all out, which they're not going to be able to handle or tolerate for a very long period of time. It's going to be about 6 seconds or less of work. It's going to be as hard of an effort as they can give. We're going to allow them passive recovery, maybe 30 to 120 seconds. The rest range is rather broad there, because you might have to start at 120 and work down as the athlete progresses over time. And the number of series is going to be 2 to 6 with a weekly frequency of 2 to 3. And Michael will go through how you lay these out, I think, across the weeks and stuff like that. So I'm not going to get into that. That'll be his piece. This training methods menu, I can't stress enough how important this is. It really helps everybody get on the same page. Once we've understood the sport demands, we've tested the athlete, we've determined what our training considerations are with regard to the parameters and the methods, we need to now audit the process. We have to monitor the process so that we can understand whether or not the athlete's making improvements. And to do that, we need to appreciate the dose-response relationship, the dose being that which we as coaches or sports medicine providers, that which we prescribe to the athlete. We write the program, we tell them how long it's going to be, we give them the sets and reps, we give them the work to rest ratio, we tell them the intensity that we want, we set the parameters, we set the guideline, the athlete goes out, they carry out this program, and then they have a response to that program. And the response is the way in which their body, their physiological system, their biomechanical system has tolerated the dose that we prescribe. As rehab professionals, you can probably appreciate this because you do this all the time. When an athlete is returning from a tendinopathy, you prescribe isometrics or eccentrics or something, and then you see what happened. How did the athlete tolerate it? How well did they do, etc. For us in energy system land, there's a few things that we can really simply do. 2 of them are literally no technology, session rating of perceived exertion or perceived recovery status scale. One, the session rating of perceived exertion is done post-workout. The second one, perceived recovery status scale, is done the following morning. Those are literally, if you have no technology and no budget, easy wins right there. If you have a little bit of technology or budget, or a lot of athletes have watches now that will do this for them, you can get heart rate response from the training session. So heart rate during training or heart rate recovery between intervals or at the end of a session, things like that. The perceptual scales that I mentioned, again, no technology needed. You just need to make sure that if you want to collect reliable data, you have to anchor the athletes to the verbiage on the scale. And so you want to really try and calibrate them by explaining the scale and relating it to a perception that they may have just experienced. So RPE, a good one is if they do a true max aerobic speed test and you show them that scale, they should probably be at a 9 or 10. That's going to be a time trial where you're really going to empty the tank and go for it. We should be able to see that, man, this is pretty maximal effort. from there, everything they do after that, they can anchor to this scale and get an appreciation for how they perceive the psychobiological state that they're going through when they perform these training programs, because it's not just training that's influencing this, it is psychobiological. So there's other factors, how well they slept last night, nutrition, hydration, and all those kinds of things, the fear of losing their starting job because they're injured, all of those things will play into this. But you want to anchor them to that scale, because notice that while it is a 0 to 10 scale, 5 is actually hard. 5 is not a middle ground. It's not the moderate. It's not the medium. So make sure they get anchored to that. The PRS scale, the perceived recovery status perception scale, this is a one that you'll ask them the next morning. And what you're really trying to determine here is their level of recovery based on asking them the question, how recovered do you feel if you needed to, how recovered do you feel, and how do you feel like you would perform if you were going to have a competition today or perform the next workout? And so you're really trying to get a sense for how well their body feels and how they feel they're going to be able to perform that day. So that, again, anchor them to the scale. A 10 obviously being very well recovered, highly energetic, ready to go. I predict that I would have a great session today. 0 being very poor. I feel exhausted. I don't think I would have a very good session today. Those are going to be important pieces of information. As you collect this stuff, you can chart the relevant external and internal training load measurements over time, show changes over time, make any course corrections to the program when a response is out of the ordinary, or you need to kind of mitigate any sort of negative response. This is a really easy and important thing to do. So there's an example of RPE. We can see that it's increasing a little bit over time. Right next to it, we have some training load information. We can see at about day 21, there was a change in the athlete's training load where their mean training load actually increased. If you're interested in more stuff like this, I wrote a paper in 2018 in International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance that covers some of these individual statistical approaches or measures to monitoring people over time. It allows us to be objective and quantifiable and enumerate the process, which I think is really important. One of the most challenging things for me is listening to people talk about an athlete returning from injury or even an athlete in training and using vague statements like, it was a high day, it was a low day, athlete did well, ran hard. I don't know what those things mean because I have no way of identifying what high is relative to anything else. It's like every morning I sit down and watch CNBC to get a sense for the market. And it would be useless if they were like, yes, S&P 500, it's on the move today, kind of high. But they never say something like that, right? They give us specific anchors, right? They say it's 12% above what it was 3 weeks ago, but it's still 20% below its average from this time last year. It's like, okay, that tells me something. You'll be able to put numbers to the actual process, enumerate it, explore whether the athlete is getting what you think they're getting when you prescribe these training programs. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tank, and we're going to see it all in practice, and I'm sure it'll be really interesting.
Thanks, P-Dub. Let's see if I can get this up. All right, everyone can see that? All right, so I'm Michael Tankovich. I'm with the Air Force Special Operations Command in North Carolina now, and prior to that, I had the pleasure of working with Patrick for 9 years. So at the end of the day, the goal for me of Return to Play is to allow the athlete to express their skill at the highest level throughout the duration of competition. And after Scott and Patrick's presentations, you can see how important energy systems training is going to be to get us back to that point. And then there's 4 main things that I try and look at to kind of know where we're going to start with this, because there's endless things you could potentially do. And Patrick laid out a lot of ways to go in this. So I'll take that again and review that in a little bit more detail. So needs analysis is number 1. Patrick did an awesome job conveying how we're going to do that. And then constraints. So Scott touched on this. Because we're rehab professionals, we are often dealing with athletes who have constraints, whether that's non-weight bearing, partial weight bearing. Someone has to be in a sling for a while. And this is where we have to focus on what the athlete can do. So using the limbs they have available to create the adaptations that we need. And this is a process that I've started doing that reduces some of the cognitive demand on us as a clinician for programming energy systems work for injured athletes. And I encourage you to try and go through the same process in your own setting, because it's going to be individualized to that. So what equipment do you have available to you? And what are the main tissues that are loaded? And what are the tissues that are protected on that equipment? So if you take this, you can create a menu. This first one will go through a lower extremity injury. So we'll start with a non-weight bearing athlete who can only train with their upper body. So you're going to list out all of the training options that they have available to you in the clinic that you can train that athlete on. And then as you go through the rehab process, they're going to be able to tolerate more weight, more load, and you're going to have less constraints, and you can start to add new modalities in for the training process. Similarly, you can go through this same process for upper extremity injuries. So you have an athlete in a sling. What are all the pieces of equipment you can use to create a training effect? And then across the rehab process, you're going to have more and more options available to you. So I'll try and share this with everyone in the sports performance special interest group. So you have something to go off of, but obviously you're going to have to do this for the setting that you're in. Next, we need to determine where the athlete is now so we can identify their limiting factor to their performance. And this will help us with ease of programming for intensity and volume that we need to do, and what's going to be most beneficial for the athlete to work on. One thing I will touch on is doing something. So obviously we have our max aerobic speed tests. You can do a yo-yo, intermittent, or beep test. But something Patrick and I discussed a lot and used was having a weekly standardized training session. And this could be something for a football athlete where they do a tempo run workout that's set at a fixed training load. So a fixed distance, a fixed rest interval, and then you use an RPE and heart rate to assess their internal response to that session. This is a good way where it's just part of the training process, but you get an idea of how the athlete's either improving or not, and whether you need to make a change. Next, I'll talk about, so Patrick laid out his menu that he used for energy systems training, and I'm going to talk about that related to the adaptations we're trying to create. The McDougall and Sale book is really good, the high performance training for sport. And in that, they synthesize a ton of research and try and show what adaptations those that you can create using specific training. There are other ways you can do this, but this is a really good general guidelines that you can use. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the central adaptations. These are things like an increase in heart volume and the wall thickness, which leads to increased cardiac output, an increase in blood volume, which means more oxygen to the working muscles. And this is a really important session or training modality. This is one that underpins the ability for an athlete to tolerate those high intensity explosive efforts, recover from them both interval to interval, but then also day to day. This system is very gradual adapting. It takes several months, 3 to 6 months to make a big change in this system. However, it begins detraining really quick. So in 1 to 2 weeks after you have your post-op shoulder, your post-op knee, they're already going to start seeing a decrement in this program. And Scott kind of touched on what that is. The nice thing with this system is because they're central adaptations, you don't need a ton of specificity. Your heart doesn't really care if it's the workload is happening in the upper extremity or in lower extremity, as long as you can increase the heart rate to in the range that it needs to be in, you can create this adaptation. So it's going to be moderate intensity, somewhere around 70 to 75% of VO2 max. For young, healthy athletes, if you're using a heart rate, this is going to be somewhere in the range of 120 to 150 beats per minute is relatively safe. These are going to be fairly long duration, so somewhere between 20 and 90 minutes, and a high frequency, anywhere from 4 to 7 sessions per week. So when you think about the fact that your heart beats 100,000 times a day, you can see that to make a morphologic change here, it's going to take a pretty big stimulus, a high volume stimulus. The next one I'm going to touch on is oxidative peripheral adaptations. And these are things like an increase in mitochondrial density and capillarization, increased oxidative reaction rate. And this allows the athlete to produce more power with less fatigue. And this is a fairly quickly adapting system. With 6 weeks of dedicated training, you can peak this system. However, it also begins to detrain really quickly. So even a week after injury, we're already going to see a decline in this ability and these athletes' ability to produce power, and there'll be less fatigue resistance. Specificity is going to be more important because these are peripheral adaptations. So if it's primarily a locomotor athlete, you need to be training the legs if you want to increase their ability to run or tolerate fatigue of the lower extremity. Intensity is going to be relatively high, so 90 to 100% VO2 max. This will correlate with an RPE somewhere around 8 to 9. Duration, so 2 to 3 minute interval with a 2 to 3 minute active rest, and you're going to complete somewhere around 6 to 10 series of this work. And this can be done 2 to 3 sessions per week. And then the last system I'll talk about is anaerobic peripheral adaptation. So this typically includes sprint interval training, and this increases the activity of glycolytic enzymes, which improves an athlete's ability to buffer hydrogen and other metabolites. And this training has also been shown to improve both peak and short-term power output. This is a system that a lot of people gravitate to. They want to train it a lot, but it's actually fairly quick adapting. So it only takes 2 or 3 weeks of training to create a good response in this system. And it actually detrains slower than the other two systems. So if you have a dedicated training block, you're going to have some residual adaptation that should be retained for up to a month. Specificity is crucial for this system. So not only making sure that you're using the muscles that you want to work that are going to lead to the goal activity, but also that the movement ergonomics are also similarly matched the competition demands. Intensity will be maximal, so RPE 10 all the way up. The duration is going to be somewhere between 5 to 40-second intervals with a 2 to 4 minute rest between reps. There's been a lot of new literature on this, and it seems like the sweet spot to maximize the system is somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds. But you can even go shorter than that as long as the intensity is really high. Frequency, this is only going to be 2 to 3 sessions per week. And ideally, these are on non-consecutive days because this type of training is going to have a high cost to the athlete. They're going to feel fatigue. They're going to start to get a heavy leg feeling if you stack too many of these sessions back to back. All right, so let's put this into practice. So we're going to do a case study with a 25-year-old linebacker. He sustained a non-contact multi-ligament knee injury with medial meniscus repair and a lateral meniscectomy. He's going to have a long immobilization period and minimal weight bearing early. And his goal is to return to his prior level of performance in the NFL. So we start with our task analysis. So here's a visual representation of the physical demands of American football. And this is what we need to get our athlete back to. So somewhere around 55 to 65 high intensity plays that are going to be grouped together with about a 35-second rest between those plays, and series that are going to last on average 6 minutes. And then this is going to be strung over the duration of about 3 to 4 hours. So we can see how important adaptations of all energy systems will be to allow the athlete not only to express his skill during the explosive efforts, but also to sustain this performance across the entire game. And we can also look at a sample in-season NFL training week. So if we assume game days on Sunday, this is what it's similar to what most teams are going to look like. There'll be a total body lift in the weight room on Monday. Players will be off on Tuesday. On Wednesday, they're going to have a combination of a lift, a relatively long duration walkthrough, and then a long practice. Thursday, they're going to have a walkthrough and a practice. On Friday, they might have a lift, a shorter walkthrough, a little bit shorter practice, a walkthrough, a relatively low intensity walkthrough on Saturday. And then game day is not only the game, but it's also their warm up for the game. And if you add up all of the duration of these activities, it's about 16 hours of total physical activity across the week and somewhere around 80 to 20 maximal efforts. So again, you can see how it's not just about those explosive efforts. It's about how can we plan training so the athlete can recover not only interval to interval, but also between practices, between games, so that they can peak on Sunday and be at their best. And then constraints. So with this case study, you can see, don't get caught up on what these timeframes are, but just that across the rehab process, the athlete's going to have less and less constraints. We'll be able to start loading them more and more. So early post-op phase, the athlete's going to be toe touch weight bearing and a straight leg immobilizer. So what can we program for energy system development, and how can we maintain or minimize their loss during this phase? So here I've got a picture of my energy system development menu for upper body only options. And personally, I find this to be one of the most challenging phases for the athlete, as they need to maintain fitness, but are most limited in the options they can utilize for training. During the first week post-op, I'll have a conversation with the athlete about the importance of minimizing training following surgery. And this includes the typical rehab focus, such as minimizing lean mass loss and strength of the involved limb, but also the systemic physiologic characteristics that the athlete has developed over years of training and competition. And a good idea is to expose the athlete to a wide variety of these upper extremity conditioning options to see which ones work best for them. Once you found those go-to options in week one, give them a familiarity, a handful of sessions so they can get comfortable on it. And then you can complete a mass test 2 or 3 weeks after that to serve as their baseline testing for the phase. So if we put in what a sample week will look like. So here you can see at the top of both on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I have listed a rehab target. So these are the typical things we think of in the clinic, like increasing range of motion, decreasing swelling, working on strength. And then below that, I have a training target. So this is more looking at our systemic adaptations that we're trying to maintain and improve for this athlete. And then below that, I have a training prescription for this training target. So on Monday, I might have them do an arms only airdyne bike. So 3 by 5 minute intervals, relatively low intensity because we're targeting cardiac output. So I'm trying to get their heart rate up to 120 to 150 beats per minute. They'll do that 3-minute interval. They'll rest until their heart rate drops below 120, and then they'll start the next one. And the reason for doing an interval here is that generally athletes who haven't had exposure to this upper extremity training, especially for cardiac adaptations, they're not going to tolerate a ton. So again, you want to get them comfortable doing this, give them some exposure, and then they'll be able to tolerate more volume as they go. And then we can repeat this across the week so that we can start to accumulate the volume that we need to maintain that adaptation. And then on Tuesday, Thursday, again, we have our rehab target. So working on range of motion, maybe some BFR strength. And then our training target. So local muscle endurance of the upper body. This is so that they can try and tolerate more of this upper body only cardiac output training. And for the prescription, I'll have them go through a circuit. So you may choose 6 exercises that they go through. They do 4 rounds of 15 reps of each exercise. The intensity is going to be hard to somewhat hard. RPE 4 to 5, and just get the athlete again comfortable working using their upper body to get a training effect. Then once we move through that phase and the athlete is able to have full weight bearing, we open up some new options now. So in addition to the upper body options, now you've added various bikes, airdyne bike, they can get in the pool. Later on in this phase, they can start working on things like sled drag, stair climber, whatever else you have available. And then at the end of it, even some running in the Ultra G. So if we look at a sample week, again, we have our rehab target at the top. So we're progressing all of our rehab targets like we would across the training process. And then below that, training target. So we're still in this phase for this athlete, we're still working on cardiac output, but our training prescription has changed. So now we can do things that do involve the lower extremity, and they can work at an intensity that is going to get their heart rate high enough to create the central adaptations that we're looking for. So doing something like multi-directional sled drags continuously. They can get in the pool if they're proficient at swimming. They can do a combination of swimming and then some track movements in the pool, as long as they can keep their heart rate up high enough. And then again, you can repeat that on another day. Now on Tuesday, Thursday, again, we have our rehab target. We're still progressing that, but alongside that, our training target is now changed. So now we're going to chase some of those peripheral oxidative adaptations. So we're going to have the athlete use their lower extremity and train fairly hard. So doing 6 series of 2 minutes of work at an RPE 8 to 9, so close to maximal, with a 2-minute active rest between series. This is a good session where you can start recording what is the either watt output or the distance the athlete is able to cover in each of those series. And that's something we want to see improve over time. And for some of you, this may look like it's a lot of training spread out over the week, but if you assume that the rehab takes about an hour and your training target's taking anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes, this entire week is about 8 hours of physical activity. And you can see, a few months out from surgery, we're about halfway to the point of total physical activity that athlete's going to need to do in an in-season training schedule, which is going to be less than what they're going to have to do in training camp. So in the back of your head, you're constantly thinking, how do we build this athlete up so they're going to tolerate the demands that are going to be placed on them when they get back to competition? And then the early return to running phase. So this is focused on building the knee's tolerance to running. And due to this constraint, on-field running is typically not demanding enough to create energy systems adaptations. The exception of this is deconditioned athletes who haven't had a lot of exposure to energy systems training prior to starting on-field running. Typically, they look really gassed, and it's actually not the knees is not the limiting factor. It's the fact that the athlete hasn't gotten their heart rate up, for the first 4 or 5 months until they get back to running. But this does it. So for this one, because the running is not going to be intense enough for an energy system stimulus, we're still going to take a lot of our ESD menu from the prior phase. So they're going to do a lot of similar things. However, the intensity is going to be able to, they're going to be able to tolerate more. So here, if we look at a snapshot of a training week, again, our rehab targets, now we're working on-field running and strength. That's a rehab target. It's not for the energy systems. Our training target, maybe on these days, because the running is going to be somewhat taxing, we have some cardiac output, which is going to be moderate intensity. And they're doing it primarily with weight-bearing activity. So elliptical, incline, treadmill walks, getting on the Aerodyne bike, but similar process and similar intensity as far as heart rates. And then on Tuesday, Thursday, our rehab target on this day is more of a recovery emphasis. We're not going to stress them too much. We're going to have a relatively easy training. But for our training target, now we're going to chase some of those anaerobic peripheral adaptations. And this is going to be maximal intensity, RPE 10. We can complete 4 series of 30 seconds on with a 3-minute rest in between each of those reps. And this is going to create some of those, this is going to be really challenging training. However, if we can accumulate 3 weeks of this prior to upping the running intensity, we can smooth the transition and potentially prevent some of that dead leg feeling that athletes often complain about as they're getting back to increasing running volume and intensity. And then later in the return to running phase, so now the athlete is tolerating more running volume. We need to do a good job monitoring that, and it is going to start being enough to create some stimulus for the energy systems. And we do want to start utilizing the stretch shortening cycle as part of our endurance training, because that's going to be very important, especially for a locomotor athlete. So we can start adding things like tempo runs, short repeat accelerations, hill sprints, resisted sprints to the process. So here, sample training week. So on Monday and Thursday, we may have some high intensity on-field running accelerations and then some strength training. And we're not going to add any additional energy systems training on these specific days. However, on Tuesday, Friday, now we have a rehab target, which is going to be tempo running, and we might set that specific volume, and then we're building up that volume over time. This is going to start to stress some of those energy systems that we want to touch on, but it may not be sufficient for the athlete. So we're going to add a little bit on top of that. And for our training target, we're going to go back to some of those peripheral oxidative adaptations. That's going to complement our tempo running. It's going to have a similar physiologic effect. However, we're going to significantly reduce the volume, because now they're doing both the tempo running and the extra peripheral oxidative training on the Aerodyne bike. So 3 series of 3 minutes on at an RPE of 8 to 9 with a 3-minute rest interval between each of those. And over the course of this training block, what we'll do is we'll up the tempo running volume, and concurrently we'll reduce the extra training target volume. And then on Wednesday, Saturday, this will serve as more of a recovery day. So now the athletes starting to do back-to-back recovery days. Again, we got to be mindful of what the knee can tolerate. So a rehab target will be recovery emphasis. Our training target will mirror that and be cardiac output, so more of that moderate intensity. And we're going to get the athlete to basically just move. Whatever pieces of equipment you have, they tolerate well. You're going to try and accumulate 60 minutes of this moderate intensity cardiac output. And the goal is that we don't neglect that system. They've spent a lot of time building it up over the last few months. So we want to make sure we're doing at least a maintenance dose of that so it doesn't decline. And then late stage return to play. So goal is to program towards specific task demands. We do need to monitor this relatively closely. And so we can determine what's the cost. We need to be mindful of what systems are going to be developed during this and if we're neglecting any of the systems. So we're going to add a lot more high intensity activities. So sprinting, plyos, change of direction, position specific drills with relevant work to rest intervals, and practice simulation. So sample week, Monday, Thursday, we might have them out on the field working on skill development, and additional after that work on some speed development or acceleration, then strength training in the weight room. No additional training targets on those days. Now on Tuesday, Friday, instead of the tempo running, they're going to continue to work on on-field skill development, which is going to have a higher intensity, but may not be enough to, again, we're still going to have to build them up to what they're going to do when they get back to practice and competition. So in addition to that, we're going to add a training target of explosive effort. So we may put them on a hill, do 2 series of 8 by 5 second reps of an RPE maximal at 10, a 60-second passive rest between each rep. So we're starting to get closer and closer to mirroring the task demands that they're going to be exposed to when they get back into practice. And then again on Wednesday and Saturday, more of a recovery emphasis both on the rehab target and the training target. So again, we don't want to neglect the cardiac output work that we've spent so much time building up, but now it's just going to be in the background as a maintenance dose. All right, so some of you might be thinking, well, I'm in a clinic and I'm lucky if I can see my post-op ACLs a couple times a week. How can I apply this? So this is an idea that I came up with. So let's say you see your athlete on Tuesday, Thursday, they're a few months out. So now they're in the stage where they're working on more advanced strengthening, and you realize how important some of this energy systems training is going to be. What you can do is use some of the work like cardiac output. Could be a warm up for their session. It could be a cool down for their session. And your job during that period of time is to educate the athlete on what this training is going to do for them, how important it is, and how it's going to help them in the future. So you can use any equipment you have in the clinic. And while you're doing that, you need to make sure you anchor them to the intensity of what this should feel like. So they need to know that this is a moderate intensity. If they have access to a heart rate monitor, you can give them a specific range to work in or work off an RPE, but anchor them to that intensity, because eventually you're going to want them to be able to do this work on their own. So say they come in a few weeks later, they're progressing well. Their cardiac output's going well. Hopefully you've done a max aerobic speed test. It's improving the way you want, but now you feel like they're ready for a little bit more intensity. So again, you're working on your rehab target, you're progressing that. And then training target, you're also going to progress. So now you're going to chase some of those peripheral oxidative adaptations. The cardiac output on these days could serve as the warm up prior to your rehab. And at the end, maybe you hit 6 series of 2 minutes of an RPE of 8 to 9 on the bike with a 2-minute active rest between series. Again, focus on this is anchor the athlete to what that intensity feels like, what that session should feel like, and then what the desired physiologic goals that are going to happen from doing that type of work. And then on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you're already going to be sending them home with some sort of home exercise program. But now they also have an energy systems component to that. So this may be something where they come into the clinic for an unsupervised session where they have guidelines of what they're trying to hit. Maybe they go to a gym that they have a membership at, or maybe they have some equipment at home that they can utilize. But you're just trying to accumulate the volume that you need to make these adaptations for the athlete. All right, and that's it from my part. I'll turn it back over to Scott if we have some time for questions.
Thanks, Tank. All right, so thanks everyone for hanging in there. We have scheduled out for the hour and a half, so we do have some time for questions. If we get a lot of them, we're happy to answer them further. So typically the way that this will work is type your question into the chat, and we're happy to read it and answer it. If it needs additional clarification, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand, and we'll go with that. But with these larger crowds, if we have people unmuting themselves as they go along, tends to get a little bit of interference there. So go ahead and pop those in. First of all, though, I want to say thanks to both of you for jumping in on this. And Tank, I'm interested, a year or so now into changeover, do you find that you've adjusted much with kind of how you're programming this, or like going into a completely different field, a different group? What have the challenges been for you? transferring over with some of the training stuff?
Well, I'd say the hardest challenge I have is I don't have Patrick as my right-hand man to help me out with all the testing and whatnot. But I think it's with the work that Patrick had done, he had so clearly defined what the task demands were for our athletes, all the way down to position group. And even we had even done hybrid positions. So a linebacker that's primarily special teams, but plays a little bit of linebacker. And we had it pretty dialed in. What I'm finding, and I'd be curious to hear because you're in a similar setting, is that there's not a whole lot of good data on the task demands. And then we have so much variety in the operators that I work with now, where, you know, depending on the mission set, we could do anything where it could be a, 12-hour ruck with 80 plus pounds at a moderate intensity and, not a great situation. Or it could be something where it's extremely high intense, it's flashbang, get in, get out type stuff. So I think this setting is fairly diverse. You have to have a good balance across all energy systems and all training. And then also the training process throughout the year, it's highly variable. These guys travel a ton, so it has to be something they can sustain and do on their own. So it needs to be easy to program. There's no way we're going to be able to monitor every session. But even the training tasks themselves, they might have a block of training where they're in a 2 or 3 week period, they're going to do 60 to 80 free fall jumps. And has a very high physiologic cost to that. Some of it's tissue specific. We see a lot of elbow issues, lateral epicondylopathy, medial epicondylopathy after those. But then also from an energy system standpoint, we really don't have good data. So we've been playing around with different monitoring devices. And these guys wear so much equipment that if you thought it was hard to get football players to wear heart rate monitors and stuff, these guys love it when they're in a training environment, but in the weight room. But when you get them outside, like the last thing they want to do is add another piece of equipment. So there's been some barriers there, but it's good to go out with them and like actually observe training, and you get a little bit of idea of what that looks like. Similar to what Patrick's talking about, like creating your task demands based on the visualization, even if it's with a stopwatch.
Yeah. And I think when in doubt and the variability is high, defaulting to those basic fundamental central adaptation, peripheral adaptation, and you can get very, very far training very, very basic within that. So we do have a question, and please feel free to continue asking them. Azita, I believe, in terms of energy system development, what are the biggest areas or concepts that you've seen a shift in recent years, or what have you changed your mind about as of late? So I think you sort of answered a little bit of that broadly, Tank. Patrick, I'll push this to you first.
I think, I don't know that there's a lot that I've changed my mind about, because the physiology is kind of the physiology, and you either train to get it or you don't. I think the shift part is always an interesting one, because it's tough, right? And because keep in mind, I've never gone to physical therapy school. I don't know what it's like, or athletic training school, or some of these sports medicine positions, there's so much to learn in the curriculum just around, just from a standpoint of how not to hurt people, or what red flags to look for, and differential diagnosis and all those things. And so there often is a lack of appreciation for anything outside of, relatively, from what I've seen, at least in my experience, remedial rehab. There's not a strong appreciation for strength and conditioning practices within return to play. There's not a strong appreciation for energy system training with regard to this stuff. So I think one of the biggest shifts is an interest, like from groups like this, in maybe trying to delve a little deeper into physiology and what it means to their practice. And I think always the hurdle, though, is the barrier of entry makes it challenging, because if you haven't been thinking like this, you haven't programmed training, strength training, and energy system training, you haven't thought from a physiological standpoint, it's hard sometimes to get started. So it seems overwhelming, but the shift is probably the interest that people have in it. I just think it's always tough for people to be like, "Gah, how do I wrap my head around, what Tank just showed, and, splitting out the days, and what's my primary target and things like that." It's a really difficult jump, but I do think that if you can be patient and think it through, there's a lot of fruits of that labor that come.
Yeah, I think for me, an acceptance, sort of a swing away from the high intensity interval is the only thing. You're seeing a resurgence of zone 2, which is great. But personally, I've also, along with that, increased my certainty that it's almost impossible to get people to do it unless they're already interested in doing it. It's just, most people like to suffer, and there's zone 2 is a feeling of this isn't that hard. And so it is very, very hard to convince. And so if you're selling this idea, if it's something you care about, and even that's basically what a lot of this aerobic adaptation type stuff is, selling it in the framework of the difference between performance and training. Training should not be performance. Performance is when you are trying to hit records. Training is when you're trying to stimulate the system. And if you sell it that way, you get a little bit more buy-in, but I can tell you that most of the time I'm probably not prescribing based off of what I would consider best, because of the fact that I realize that people aren't going to do it. So that's the biggest thing there.
Always difficult. I do. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to piggyback off that. If people are curious where to start and you haven't looked in the chat function, Scott did share both the textbook that we all referenced as well as their article that Patrick and Scott published. So definitely download those. Those are fantastic resources to kind of get started. And then I also want to say that with Scott, like I've run into a similar issue. I'd say less so with the guys I have now. They're more receptive to some of that lower intensity just because, they've had to ruck their faces off to get where they are. So they've got a ton of exposure to it. But even being creative with that, for team sport athletes, they may not like getting on a bike for a long time, especially a UBE or an Aerodyne where they're doing just arms. But getting them out on the field, doing things like sled drags where it's up to what you can do. If you understand what the intensity and of what you're trying to create, what the adaptation is, you can take something as simple as a sled, and I can train everything all the way from cardiac output, doing a continuous session for 20 plus minutes that an athlete may tolerate. And a lot of guys football guys seem to gravitate towards that, all the way up to doing some of those really intense intervals. So the aerobic peripheral adaptations where you're going, balls to the wall for 2-minute intervals in the same direction, and just you're going max distance as far as you can. So I think sometimes you can use a simple tool. You can even put together, circuits that look like a strongman circuit. So maybe you're doing kettlebell carries with a sled drag and something, monitor it with a heart rate monitor. And if you're trying to do cardiac output, you can still work in that realm and be creative with the training. And you're almost kind of tricking them into getting that stimulus without having to put them on a piece of cardio equipment.
I also think like programming a little bit of it for yourself is super useful, because then what it feels like. Like I always say, like if it's hard, I think if you're like a rehab professional who's never, like, let's say take a football offensive lineman, if you've never been under a bar and squatted, and I'm not saying you got to squat 500 pounds, but just like if you've ever had weight on your back, it's a lot easier to coach and appreciate it than if you just write it on a program and hope that someone does it. So programming some of this stuff and seeing what it feels like is really important. But I did want to there's a few questions that came in, but I do want to not pass by. There's a comment from Justin Clifford, the one that says, the change in mindset can be very freeing and prevent extra junk training that we see so much in rehab. This is a massively important comment, and maybe Tank can talk about this, but there was a time like 6 or 7 years ago where I did tell Michael, like I said, write down, take like a week and put together 7 PowerPoint slides or 5 or whatever it is, no more than 8. Write down what your return to play rehab philosophy is, what's important to you. And he did it. And then he came back and I said, what did you learn? And he said, I learned that half the shit I'm writing in my programs isn't even important to the things that I think are important. And all of a sudden he was like, geez, that like gives me a lot of time to work on the things that we actually need in return to play. Cause now I'm like, when I think about it, I'm like, yeah, why am I doing that? I'm just doing it to do it, you know? And so that's a massive comment. It's a super big thing.
Right. And I would disagree with Jason that I'm quite happy just not pushing hard enough to not throw up. I'm not a big fan of throwing up during. I pay a lot of good money for the food that I eat. Ryan asked about utilize any specific programs or data systems to monitor training volume and progression of your programming. That is going to depend a lot on the situation that you're in. With my location, we are they want us to use Smartabase, so where it's kind of dictated. In a rehab setting, though, because of various issues with patient confidentiality, we can't actually use it to its best extent. So I typically am defaulting back to identifying a KPI, and I write that KPI in my note, and then I will go back and retest at whatever intervals I anticipate has a high likelihood for change to have occurred. So if I'm doing something like mass, it might be every 4 weeks that we retest mass and then dose based off of it. So that's the thing that I use. I know Patrick will write up about 15 different dashboards for people to use, and then most of the time they're not used. So there's all sorts of things out there, but I can tell you that the biggest problem with systems is that a lot of people spend more time trying to find the perfect system than something that's flexible and adapts. I can say for myself, getting that whole idea of KPIs, identify the frequency that you would anticipate change to have occurred, and then test at that time point. And whatever's the easiest way with your EMR or whatever system you use to identify that and track it to remind you, probably what's going to work best. Any thoughts on that from either of you?
I mean, I think whatever you're tracking should just be something that is important, like anything. It always starts with the question. You could track it in Excel, you could track it, it doesn't have to be something fancy or your own homemade web app or anything like that. Just make sure, I'd always rather have people be targeted. You go to these conferences and you see people with dashboards of 20 variables and everything turns red, yellow, or green. And I say, well, if 2 out or 3 out of 20 are red, what do you do? And they say, well, it kind of depends on which 3, because if it's these 3, then I really worry and I tell the coach, but if it's these 3, I'm not as worried about it. I'm like, okay, get rid of everything except those 3, right? Because those you just told me are the most important ones. For whatever reason, you've attached them to some sort of endpoint that matters, whether that's improved performance, whether that's decreased risk of injury, whether that's enhancement in adding training load and volume in return to play, whatever that endpoint is. You've identified that those 3 things matter. I'd rather be really good at doing those 3 things and charting those over time, because I'm going to hang my hat on those, than a whole bunch of things that it's like, oh, that's really cool. I've got a whole bunch of charts and graphs, but it's just a data graveyard. There's just data there, and it's not really answering your question. So always come up with a really good question. And like my PhD supervisor, Barry Drest, always used to say, just because we can measure something doesn't mean we should. Lots of things can be measured, but doesn't mean they're important. So,
Right. So Mike or Tank, I guess, I'm not used to seeing your name and I read it. You have 2 questions. I guess you're the most popular here. So first one that I think is in-depth, relevant specifically here is, in your clinical example with the 2 days in the clinic to help them clarify the training prescription, is that example 20 minutes of continuous plus the 6 series, or is this example just the 6 series that is about 20 minutes in length total? And then The
Yeah.
second question is more specific to, I'll read it off once you answer that.
Yeah, I'll answer. This is my fault. I did a poor job of explaining this. So yeah, what I was putting in here is that you are going to need more volume. If cardiac output is a target that you want for your athlete, it is going to require more volume. This can serve. So this is 20 minutes of cardiac output work. So that moderate intensity, RPE 4 to 5, the heart rate between 120 and 150 ish. In addition to that, they're also going to do the intervals for the peripheral oxidative adaptation. So this cardiac output, once the athlete's familiar with it, it can serve as a really good warm up for your rehab target. So if you say you have the athlete, they're coming in at 10 o'clock, you could have them say, come in at 9:40. I want you to hop on the bike. We'll have the heart rate monitor out for you, put it on, hop on the bike. I want you to accumulate 20 minutes there and then, or maybe 10 minutes there and 10 minutes incline treadmill walk. And the goal is to warm them up for your rehab. So you don't have to, you can get right into whatever quality you want to work on that day. And then at the end of that, or wherever it's appropriate in that particular training session, then you can do your interval training for the more intense ones. Obviously that doesn't have to be in there, but I put it in there to show just that's a way you can accumulate this volume because it does take a lot more than some of the other training modalities. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. And then Brian is asking specifically to the shift, how much are you basically looking at environmental physiological adaptations or demands like high altitude on top of training stuff? I think touch on that briefly, but I want to get to the other question and then we're getting out of time, but maybe we need to do a training for tactical athletes talk here with the tactical SIG at some point, because we've gotten a lot of questions on that. Yeah,
I'm reading this question. I think I'm reading it more as how do you deal with the fact that the environment may be tough, like lack of sleep, extremes in training, and then altitude being one of those. And what I would say, like a lot of what I've programmed for athletes when they have a tough training calendar and they're away a lot is that because the one adaptation that takes the longest to create, and it also does decline fairly rapidly, is if you're beat up from training, you're not getting great sleep, the one thing that you can work on that's going to have a fairly low cost is that the more low intensity zone 2 cardiac output type work. You can still do that. That may be as easy as they go for a 30-minute run. If they're proficient at running and their heart rate doesn't get too high, you go for a 30-minute run to start your day off. But the flip side of that is if they are in town, they're getting good sleep, their nutrition is good. That's in a time where if we need them to be well balanced and they need more of that high intensity work, that's a great time to plug in some of those peripheral oxidative or peripheral anaerobic adaptations where even if it is a higher cost, they can tolerate that, they can recover from it. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. Patrick, do you look at splits within a mass test or do you look at total distance covered within the time duration as a whole? I'm not quite sure what splits you would look at.
Like time splits, like a 1 minute, I think.
I guess.
If I'm reading that right. No, I don't. I look at it's a time trial. It's only, like I said, 4 to 6 minutes. So you're really looking for them to empty the tank. There's some calculations if you're doing like a critical velocity test, which is a little different. There's some calculations you have to do at the, after a certain time point. But MAS is just super simple. It's 4 minutes, empty the tank, give me everything you got. I'm not really interested in the splits. I don't want them to pace. That it's a really tough. And as humans, we just generally do it. Like if Scott was like, okay, you got to do an MAS test today and go for a 4 minute all out run. Like, I'm still gonna be like, yeah, screw you. I'm going to pace a little bit, but you just do it. You're trying to go as hard as you can. That's all I care about. So no, I don't look at splits.
Yeah. And I find cueing during the pacing aspect is just like, if you see someone go all out maximally, I don't say much because they'll just fatigue out and then it'll slow down and it'll sort of sort itself out.
Do the test tomorrow.
Yeah. But if they're really pacing themselves low, I will give verbal encouragement of, hey, you know what? Like Patrick was talking about, if you're wearing a heart rate monitor and that heart rate is not climbing at all, I'm going to start giving some feedback because I know that my test is going to have a problem. Which leads into Devin's question of, I think it was you, Patrick, using a testing or monitoring method to measure change of internal response to a fixed training load. Is this used to measure a physiological adaptation, fitness fatigue monitoring? Do you have any quick recommendations on how to use this info to make decisions regarding energy system development prescription?
Yeah, I think it was Tank that mentioned it. It was something that we had tried to do, like picking a standard component of a standard exercise or training of the week. So it was like a tempo run, and we, set at a certain pace. So you might have like some beeps, you might make some audible beeps or something like that, set it at a certain pace, and then evaluate the heart rate response to that over time. There's been some papers on this submax fitness testing. There's been some on field sport athletes. I'm blanking on Lambert and Lamberts did a lot in cycling athletes. Darren Burgess had some papers in Australian football players. So you can certainly, if you search submax fitness testing, they are usually trying to make a determination on if, like, let's say they do this every 2 weeks twice a week as part of a warm up. They're trying to evaluate, well, what's the typical heart rate response? And the tricky thing is that if it's too submaximal, the heart rate response might not be reliable enough. I think Lamberts and Lambert, if I remember from their PhD, it was you had to get to at least over like an 85% max heart rate in order for the recovery time to be somewhat reliable. Now that was with cyclists, so it might be different for running. For Tank and I, we tried and failed to look at the accelerometer and look at vertical z-axis activity. And so under the belief that, like, well, if someone's fatigued, do they spend more time on the ground? But body worn accelerometer wasn't really great for that because it's too much shaking up of the body. Maybe we would have seen something different if we had an accelerometer on the shank or in the shoe itself, something lower and closer to the actual piece that's touching the ground versus being on the torso. But that was the thought process, was to monitor fitness and fatigue. And then and that comes from those papers I referenced. And then making recommendations on that was, if you look at how Tank laid out his training week, it's basically like, okay, well, if the athlete is supposed to do this intense workout on Monday and they come in and the drop is outside of the, minimally important difference, maybe we take that Monday session and we push it to Tuesday and we flip flop and we do the Tuesday easier session or the Wednesday easier session on the Monday, something like that. That was the idea. Largely failed, probably more my fault than Tank's, but yeah.
And I would say that the simple way I use that, we tried to do more with the accelerometers, but also even just measuring heart rate. So it's a good question, because if you have a standardized tempo run, so your work to rest ratios are standardized, the distance is standardized, you can't determine why there's a change in fitness. Is it due to fatigue if they're getting worse, or if they're getting better? You can't say that, oh, it's their peripheral oxidative system or it's their central, but you can measure something weekly to see how they're tracking over time. So in an ideal situation, if you're programming appropriate training and you're not accumulating an excess of fatigue, you should see that their heart rate response, their internal response to that, both heart rate and RPE, given a similar workload, they should improve. So they should have a lower heart rate and or lower RPE for that session.
Yeah. And there's two specific ones that have been kind of designed for this. So it's like the Astrand or something cycling test, where you're choosing a intensity that you're trying to hit a heart rate somewhere between, I believe it's like 120 and 170. And so you choose a workload, you cycle at it for 6 minutes, and then you're just tracking your heart rate at that. That's an older test that's been around a long time as a submax one. The other one that I've used that works out pretty well, and especially in a rehab setting, is instead of a steady state and heart rate response, is a ramp protocol that with a cutoff for the heart rate. So The Yo-Yo Intermittent Fitness Test has a rehab version. If you look up just rehab version, Yo-Yo Intermittent Fitness Test, where you'll see what stage they get to at, let's say, 130 beats per minute. And then when you're testing them, you're not pushing them beyond that each time. You could do the same with a Bruce protocol or a cycle ramp test or anything else like that. But I think there's a lot of good options.
Also, just because everything is energy system training, people have tried to do this with linear position transducers on a barbell. So bar velocity changes week to week. People have tried to do this with changes in impulse on a force plate. If you're jumping or you're doing like a mid thigh pull or something like that. So it doesn't have to just be, we say energy system and people think running and biking, but it could be any of those things people have tried, and there's a decent amount of literature of lots of failures. But
the Kansas squat test, I believe,
Kansas
is the
squat
one
test.
Yeah. All right. On that note, I think we'll wrap it up here. We stayed somewhat close to our time frame. Got all the questions answered. So thanks everyone who hung around till the end. If you have any further questions or interest, I think all of us are active on social media. Welcome to reach out there.